This is the video series that I wish I had when I was learning Horizon Worlds. But as a quick note, there is a lesson 0 of sorts which introduces this video series and goes over the basics of build mode, movement, and menu and UI management. So if you haven't seen that already, go ahead and check that out now, because this video will assume you know that information already. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to build primitive objects from your build menu, and then learn how to move, scale, and rotate that object. We'll then go over the duplicate and array tools, both of which help immensely for creating complex objects very quickly. After that, we'll dive into the snapping tool, which allows you to build with incredible precision. Lastly, we'll put all of those tools into practice by building a simple chair and learn some really great tips and tricks while we do. Let's get started. To build your first object in Horizon Worlds, I'm going to hit the menu button on my left touch controller to bring up the build menu. Here you'll see a handful of basic shapes to pick from. For now, I'll just use this cube by pointing at it, using the trigger, dragging it out into the world, and releasing. We won't need the build menu for a couple minutes, so I'll close that now. And before we get started, make sure the snapping tool is turned off. That's the little magnet symbol on your left controller here. We're going to get into what this tool does in a few minutes, but for now, turn it off so it doesn't get in the way. Go ahead and enable your selection tool if it isn't already. That's the little hand symbol here on your right hand. This tool is how you grab and select objects, but it's also how you grab and interact with UI panels like we discussed in the last video. A quick note, if it wasn't obvious already, your selector is actually this little teardrop symbol hovering above the controls on both of your hands, not your hand itself. So whenever I want to grab or select something throughout this series, what I'm referring to is this blue selector. Now that the object is placed into the world, there are several things that you're able to do. I can move it around by putting my selector into the object, squeezing and holding the index finger trigger, and dragging it around. To deselect an object, just put your selector into empty space outside of the object and tap the trigger to deselect. A quick tip here is that if you squeeze and hold the trigger in empty space, you'll notice a plus and minus symbol appear on your controls. Selecting these will increase or decrease the size of your selector. This is really helpful if you have a bunch of objects in front of you and you're trying to mop up all of them at once, and the precision selector just isn't getting the job done fast enough. So select your cube here that you just built, and you should notice these little red, green, and blue boxes appear. These are the controls for each axis of this object. As you can see, each one corresponds with the X, Y, and Z dimensions. If you move your selector into one of these handles, it'll split into 3 different controls for you. The straight arrow here will move the object along that specific axis. The curved double arrow here will rotate the object along the axis. And the little cube here will shrink or stretch your object along that axis. Additionally, if you grab any one of these controls and start moving the object, you can hit this fine-tune button here on your controller. This will change the sensitivity of your movements, allowing you much greater precision. This makes it really easy to get your objects looking exactly how you want them to. Last but not least, if you grab an object with one hand and then grab it with your other hand, you can bring your hands together or move them apart to scale the object bigger and smaller. Great, so now you can build an object from the build menu, move that object along a particular axis, and scale and shrink that object. Now let's look at the duplicate tool. Without any objects selected, you should see the duplicate tool here on your right hand. First, I'll select the duplicate tool and then reach out and grab an object as if I'm trying to move it. As you'll notice, your original object stayed exactly where it was, and a second object is now moving with your hand. I can release this and repeat that action to create as many objects as I need. When I'm ready to stop duplicating objects, I can go back to my selection tool here. The second way to use the duplicate tool is probably my favorite. With the selection tool still enabled, I'll grab an object and start moving it around. While holding the object, I can now tap the duplicate tool to place a new object at that exact location. This is a really awesome way to build, for example, a bunch of trees in just a few seconds. The last way to use the duplicate tool is by using it in combination with the axis controls that we talked about earlier. With the duplicate tool selected, I can grab any one of these handles and start to move. This will leave the original object where it was and begin dragging a duplicate object along the axis of that handle. An extension of the duplicate tool is the array tool. In short, the array tool will continue to duplicate objects along a set path. That path is determined by your most recent use of the duplicate tool. To use the array tool, I will first duplicate this cube along this axis, and once I do that, the array tool appears here on my left hand. If I tap it, you'll notice another cube appear along that same axis. And if I keep pushing the Array Tool button, cubes continue to spawn along that axis. The Array Tool is a really fast way to make, for example, a set of stairs, or even some really interesting looking organic shapes. Now you'll notice we have a bit of a mess of objects. So if you look at your left hand, you should see the undo function. As I tap this button, it will undo your most recent action, and then the one before that, and so on. You can also use the redo button to go back in the other direction if you accidentally undo a little bit too far. Awesome. So now you can build an object from the build menu, move, scale, and rotate that object, and use the duplicate and array tools. This is already a powerful set of tools that allows you to make virtually anything you can imagine in Horizon Worlds. But let's take a look at a tool that allows an incredible amount of precision when building objects. Now it's time to turn on snapping mode. Enabling this will turn on the world grid view and allow you to snap objects to both the world and to other objects. So once you've enabled the snap tool on your left hand, which is that little magnet symbol, and I go to select an object, you'll notice a bunch of these little dots within that object that correspond to every corner and center point of that object. These are your snapping points, and you can use these as anchors when I go to grab an object. When you're moving an object around with the snap tool enabled, you'll notice a bunch of snapping points in the area surrounding the anchor point you've grabbed. These represent the world grid. By default, the snap tool lets you move an object in increments of 1/4 of a meter. So if I move this square along this axis, you can see that instead of moving smoothly, it will move in short increments. This is also true with the resize handle, and even with the rotation handle, which will snap in increments of 15 degrees. A quick pro tip here, you can adjust the size of your snapping points and rotation angle by opening your build menu and going to the settings panel. Here you'll see the default set at 1/4 of a meter, but I can go all the way down to 0.1 meters or all the way up to 100 meters. I can also change the value of my rotation angle right here, or even whether I want to disable snapping being applied to the rotation entirely within the snap tool. For me personally, I usually leave these options set to the default values. Snapping to the world grid is great, but the snap tool really comes in handy when you start snapping objects to other objects. I'm gonna grab a couple more objects and put them into the world, and now I can grab one of these anchors on either object, move the objects together, and snap them to each other along any one of your snapping points. So I can, for example, snap the center point of this cube to the corner point of this cube. I can also use this in combination with the duplicate and array tools that we mentioned earlier. So I can reshape this cube to be more like a step and snap it to the world to ensure that it's parallel to the ground. If I position myself so that I'm sort of facing the step directly, I can enable my duplicate tool, grab the bottom center anchor point here, and then drag it to the top rear anchor point so that it looks like a second step. Then I can just tap my array tool a few times, and you have a set of stairs. One great tip about the snap tool is that you don't actually need objects to touch each other in order to snap them to each other. For example, say I wanted two objects that are placed apart from each other to be the exact same height. If I grab the resize handle of one of them and start scaling the object, I can continue to hold my trigger finger, come over to this other object, and use any one of these anchor points. You should see this little green line appear indicating that the two objects are aligned along whichever anchor point you've selected. This also works if you just want to make sure objects positioned apart from each other are aligned along a particular axis. I use this part of the snapping tool constantly, and you'll find that this is super helpful when you start to build more complex objects. Wow, that was a lot, but between this, your movement controls, the duplicate and array tools, you now know everything you need to know to make any object that is possible to build within Horizon Worlds. Pat your avatar on the back because that is a huge achievement. Great job. That was a ton of information though, and all we have to show for it is a bunch of these gray cubes floating around my world. So let's put everything we learned into practice. I'm going to make a simple wooden chair and share some great building tips while I do. For the chair, let's start with the legs. I want my object to be a little bit more rounded, so I'll take the rounded cube here out of my build menu, and using the snapping mode, I'll make sure that it's parallel to the ground. Now I'll stretch it up to make it look like the leg of a chair. Now I will select my duplicate tool and move the object along this axis. This will leave the original object where it was and create a second object that is parallel to the first, just like the front two legs of a chair. Now I'm going to select both objects at once. To do this, I will squeeze and hold the trigger here in empty space and drag my selector through both objects. You'll know you have both selected because you can see this blue bounding box that encompasses both of my objects. With the duplicate tool enabled again, I'll duplicate both of these objects simultaneously and move them back to create the last 2 chair legs. Now let's make the seat of the chair. I'll grab another rounded cube from the build menu and flatten and stretch it into something that looks like a seat. Now you might notice a small problem here. I want to have the seat overhang the legs by a small amount, but if you grab the anchor point on your seat, you'll notice that there's nowhere to snap to in the middle of all 4 of your legs. This is something that happens quite often when building. To get around this, I'll need to make a snapping point myself. To do that, I'll just duplicate this seat, and using the snap tool and anchor points, I'll place it in between these chair legs and stretch it out to fill the entire gap between all 4 legs, ensuring that I've aligned it flush with the top of the legs. Now I can grab my seat, adjust it to the size that I want, and then snap it to the center of this new object. You'll find countless situations when building in Horizon Worlds where this trick comes in very handy. Now I'll finish this up by making the back of the chair. I'll use 2 cylinders of equal size, and I'll grab another rounded cube here and flatten it to look like the back of a chair. If you're building your chair exactly like mine, you'll need to use a second measurement tool to snap to the center. And now I can delete this measurement block. Lastly, I'll grab all of the pieces of my chair back and snap it into place. I'll slide the chair back in a little bit, and I also want to add a slight angle to it by using the rotation handle on your object. The 15-degree snap tool is a bit much for me, so I'll hit the fine-tune tool here. This will override the snapping function and let me get the exact angle that I want. Now I'll just adjust the back position as needed, and we're done building our chair. Well, almost. Ultimately, you'll want to turn this collection of objects into a single grabbable object. To do this, first select all of the objects within the chair. If I put my selector inside of one of these objects, you'll now notice that your controls have a group option. If I tap this, all of the objects in my chair are now grouped into a single object. Now I am able to grab the chair and move it around just as easily as if it was a single primitive object. To ungroup the object and make changes, simply select the object, put your hand into it again, and select the Ungroup button. Now I can edit my chair however I need, and regroup it when I'm done. There's actually another way to edit the objects inside of a group without having to ungroup the object first, but I'm going to save that for the next video, which will go over some more advanced building techniques. One important thing to note when you're grouping objects is that the orientation of the final grouped object will match the orientation of the first object you select within that group. Meaning, if I select my chair back first, which is tilted at an angle, you'll notice that the final group is also tilted at an angle. So if I'm moving my object around using the snap tool, you can see that it's much harder to get my chair to align perfectly to the ground. So when grouping several objects, just make sure that the first object you select is oriented how you want your final object to be. The chair is now oriented correctly, and my sanity is preserved. Now I finally have a chair grouped as a single object, and it's time to make this look like a nice brown wood texture instead of a solid gray. To apply color and texture to my object, I'll open my build menu and come over here to the paintbrush menu. I'll look around here for a nice brown wood color, but if you don't see one that you like right away, you can always select a different palette from this drop-down menu. However, this one in the default panel looks fine to me, so I'll go with that for now. If I scroll down slightly, I will see all of my texture options. I'll scroll here until I find a wood texture and select that. Now on my right hand, I will select the paintbrush tool. Using the plus button, I'll make my brush size larger and then drag the selection bubble over all of the objects in my chair. This looks fantastic. You now have a wooden chair. One more tip I want to mention about the painting tool is the eyedropper tool. Say for example, you're jumping between colors and textures when painting your world. It's a pain to constantly go back into the menu every time you want to go to an old color or texture that you've used. Say that I want to paint this cube the same color as my chair here. All I need to do is put my selector into the chair and I can see that the eyedropper symbol has appeared. If I tap that, my paintbrush tool will instantly change to match the color and texture of this object. And now I can quickly paint my cube here without having to dive back into the build menu. Wow, that was a lot of info, and now you can build nearly any object that you can imagine using just your hands inside of VR. And I think that is so cool. One final tip I want to mention before wrapping this up is the asset library. If I open my build menu and navigate to this shopping bag symbol here, you'll find hundreds of assets that are pre-built for you. Because these assets are from Meta directly, they can actually provide you with objects that have much greater detail and more complex surfaces than what you're able to build with just primitive shapes. We'll go over how I like to use these assets in the next video and discuss how they contribute to the overall object capacity of your world, but I do want to point out the Shapes panel here. This is where you'll find a larger variety of basic shapes than what you can find in just the main build panel here. I'm not sure why Meta has put these shapes into two different places, but regardless, you can find a wide variety of shapes here that might work better for you when you're building. While there is enormous potential in the tools that you've learned already, believe it or not, this is just the beginning of what Horizon Worlds has to offer. In the next video, we're going to start going over more advanced building techniques, as well as start to dive into the physics engine, sound, and music within Horizon Worlds. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.